December 8, 1941, Washington, D.C., War Department Headquarters. Colonel Frank Capra sat in a darkened screening room watching footage that filled him with despair. The film was Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's masterwork of Nazi propaganda. 700,000 uniformed Germans marching in perfect unison, their faces lit with fanatical devotion to Adolf Hitler. Aerial shots of geometric precision, torchlight rallies creating rivers of flame, orchestrated spectacle on a scale never before captured on film. Capra had directed some of Hollywood's most beloved films. It Happened One Night, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, You Can't Take It With You. But watching Riefenstahl's creation, he felt helpless. I could see where the kids of Germany would go any place, die for this guy, he later wrote. How do we counter that? General George Marshall had recruited Capra just days after Pearl Harbor with an urgent mission: make films that would explain to American soldiers why they were fighting, transform a nation of isolationists into warriors willing to die on foreign soil, counter the most sophisticated propaganda machine the world had ever seen. The films Capra would create, the Why We Fight series, would be seen by 54 million Americans by war's end. They would win Academy Awards, change documentary filmmaking forever, and help determine the outcome of history's bloodiest conflict. But first, Capra had to solve an impossible problem. How do you fight a propaganda masterpiece with truth? In 1941, nobody understood propaganda's power better than the Nazis. For nearly a decade, Joseph Goebbels had transformed cinema into a weapon more effective than tanks or artillery. His Ministry of Propaganda controlled every aspect of German film production. Scripts, directors, actors, distribution, all served the Reich. Triumph of the Will set the standard. Filmed at the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, Riefenstahl's documentary employed techniques that revolutionized filmmaking. Cameras mounted on elevators captured sweeping vertical shots. Moving cameras on tracks created fluid motion through massed crowds. Aerial photography from aircraft showed the rally's geometric perfection from above. Long focus lenses compressed perspective, making crowds seem even more massive and unified. The film wasn't documenting the rally, it was constructing reality. The rally itself had been choreographed like a movie set specifically for Riefenstahl's cameras. With 30 cameras and a crew of 150, every speech, march and procession was orchestrated for maximum cinematic impact. Nothing was left to chance. Hitler personally approved the title and served as unofficial executive producer. The result was 2 hours of overwhelming spectacle designed to create specific psychological effects. Opening with Hitler descending from clouds like a deity, showing German youth singing songs of devotion with faces glowing with purpose, presenting the Führer as Germany's savior, the embodiment of national will. The film won awards in Germany, France and Italy. It was screened in schools across the Reich, attendance mandatory for students. German audiences saw themselves transformed into something magnificent, a unified movement restoring national greatness. The film's impact on German morale and military recruitment was, as one study concluded, an effective way of sponsoring enthusiasm for military service. But Goebbels understood something crucial about propaganda. It couldn't be obviously manipulative. It had to work subtly, infiltrating minds without triggering defensive skepticism. The easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into most people's minds, Goebbels' counterpart in America later explained, is to let it go in through the medium of an entertainment picture when they do not realize that they are being propagandized. The Germans had a decade-long head start in weaponizing cinema. While Hollywood produced musicals and romantic comedies, Nazi filmmakers created an arsenal of psychological warfare, Feature films presented idealized visions of Aryan life. Documentaries showed German military might as unstoppable. Newsreels framed every development as evidence of inevitable victory. The propaganda worked. By 1939, German morale was extraordinarily high. Young men eagerly enlisted, convinced they served a noble cause. The population accepted wartime sacrifices without complaint. Alternative viewpoints had been systematically erased from public discourse. When Capra watched Triumph of the Will in that screening room, he confronted propaganda at its most effective. The film had helped transform an entire nation's psychology. It had made dictatorship seem glorious, militarism appear noble, and submission look like strength. More terrifyingly, it had done all this through artistry of undeniable technical brilliance. Capra's background made him an unlikely choice for psychological warfare. He was a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in America as a child. His films celebrated American ideals: individual liberty, democratic values, the common man triumphing over corruption. He had never made a documentary. He had no military training. He had no experience with propaganda filmmaking. But Marshall saw something others missed. Capra understood narrative, emotion, and how cinema could shape belief. His films had made audiences feel things deeply: hope, patriotism, moral clarity. Those same skills, applied to documenting the reality of the war, could counter Nazi lies. The challenge was monumental. American public opinion in late 1941 was deeply divided. A Gallup poll taken just before Pearl Harbor showed only 52% believed war with the Axis was inevitable. Many Americans viewed European conflicts as none of their concern. The isolationist movement remained powerful and vocal. The attack on Pearl Harbor shifted opinion dramatically. A poll taken after December 7th showed 97% support for war, an unprecedented level of national unity. But Marshall understood that outrage wouldn't sustain a multi-year global conflict. Soldiers needed to understand why they were fighting, what they were defending, and why victory mattered. The Why We Fight series would provide that understanding. 7 films, released between 1942 and 1945, each examining a different aspect of the war. Prelude to War would explain the rise of fascism and the fundamental conflict between tyranny and freedom. The Nazis' strike would cover Hitler's conquests of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Divide and Conquer would document the blitzkrieg across Europe. The Battle of Britain would show British resistance against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Russia would present the Soviet Union as a crucial ally. The Battle of China would explain Japanese aggression in Asia. War Comes to America would trace America's journey from isolationism to involvement. Capra's solution to competing with Riefenstahl was elegant in its simplicity. He would use the enemy's own propaganda against them. Triumph of the Will and other Axis films became raw material for Allied counter-propaganda. The same footage designed to inspire Germans would be recontextualized to horrify Americans. The technique was devastatingly effective. Riefenstahl's sweeping shots of massed Nazi rallies, accompanied by new narration, became evidence of fascist mind control. Hitler's impassioned speeches, subtitled in English, revealed the dictator's megalomania and aggression. Japanese footage showing military might was reframed as proof of expansionist ambitions. Italian newsreels glorifying Mussolini's conquests demonstrated the brutality of fascism. Capra assembled a remarkable team. Walter Huston, one of Hollywood's most trusted voices, provided narration that conveyed reliability and credibility. William Hornbeck, a masterful editor, shaped thousands of feet of footage into compelling narratives. Disney Studios produced animated segments explaining complex strategic concepts. Composers created musical scores that amplified emotional impact. The production process was intensive. Capra and his team located archives of enemy films across government facilities. They reviewed thousands of hours of footage, selecting the most powerful images. When documentary footage didn't exist for crucial events, they reenacted scenes under War Department supervision. Everything was verified for historical accuracy. The first film, Prelude to War, premiered in 1942. Its structure established the template for the series. It presented the conflict as a battle between two worlds, the slave world of fascism and the free world of democracy. Using stark contrasts, it showed Germans, Italians, and Japanese being systematically indoctrinated from childhood. Children singing songs praising Hitler, their faces shining with programmed devotion. Youth organizations teaching military discipline and unquestioning obedience. Education systems erasing critical thinking and replacing it with fanatical loyalty. The film then contrasted this with American values. Shots of the Lincoln Memorial and the Gettysburg Address. Images of diverse Americans living in freedom, debating ideas, pursuing individual dreams. The message was unambiguous. This was a fundamental struggle between incompatible visions of human society. President Franklin Roosevelt watched Prelude to War and immediately recognized its power. "Every man, woman, and child in the world must see this film," he declared. He ordered it released not just to military personnel, but to civilian audiences nationwide. The film ran in theaters across America alongside commercial features. The impact was measurable. War bond purchases increased dramatically in areas where the film screened. Recruitment numbers rose. Factory absenteeism decreased as workers understood their labor's importance. Public opinion polls showed increased understanding of why America was fighting. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1943, but more importantly, it achieved Marshall's strategic objective. American soldiers who watched it before deployment reported feeling they understood the conflict's stakes. They weren't just fighting against enemy armies, they were defending freedom itself against totalitarian slavery. The production techniques Capra employed were revolutionary for government films. He borrowed liberally from Hollywood's toolkit while maintaining documentary credibility. The opening sequence of Prelude to War established the pattern. Rapid montage showing flags falling to represent conquered nations, each flag falling accompanied by drum beats, creating visceral impact. The sequence communicated in seconds what paragraphs of text couldn't convey. The visual contrast technique became Capra's signature. Split-screen shots showing free children playing alongside regimented Hitler youth marching. Quick cuts between Lincoln's words about government of the people and Hitler's speeches about absolute obedience. Images of bustling American streets contrasted with rigid military parades. The technique bypassed rational analysis, creating emotional responses that lingered. Music played a crucial role in shaping viewer emotion. The Army Air Force Orchestra performed original scores specifically composed for each film. Triumphant marches accompanied Allied victories. Ominous minor keys underscored Nazi aggression. Mournful strings played during sequences showing civilian suffering. The musical manipulation was sophisticated. When showing German military might, the score would initially seem impressive, powerful, organized, overwhelming. Then the music would shift subtly, introducing discordant notes suggesting something wrong beneath the surface. By the sequence's end, what seemed impressive became sinister. Narration carried extraordinary weight. Walter Huston's voice became synonymous with the series. His delivery combined authority with warmth, a father figure explaining difficult truths. The scripts avoided condescension while remaining accessible. Complex geopolitical realities were explained through clear language and helpful visual aids. Animation sequences helped audiences grasp strategic concepts. Disney animators created maps showing military movements. Arrows and symbols illustrated blitzkrieg tactics. Timelines clarified the sequence of conquests and alliances. Statistical graphics showed production comparisons between Axis and Allied powers. These educational segments transformed abstract strategy into concrete understanding. Soldiers watching learned how their individual actions fit into larger operations. Factory workers saw how production quotas translated to battlefield advantage. Civilians understood how rationing freed resources for military use. The series continued with increasing sophistication. The Nazis' strike used German invasion footage to demonstrate blitzkrieg tactics while explaining how appeasement had failed. It showed Chamberlain's peace agreements being violated with contempt. It documented the systematic destruction of Polish cities and the terror bombing of civilians. It made clear that negotiation with fascism was impossible. Only defeat would end the threat. The film's analysis of appeasement resonated particularly strongly. It showed British and French leaders believing Hitler's promises at Munich. It documented how each concession emboldened further aggression. It established that weakness invited attack while strength deterred it. The lesson applied beyond Europe. It shaped American understanding of how to deal with totalitarian regimes. Divide and Conquer covered the fall of France and the Low Countries. The film employed newsreel footage from both Axis and Allied sources. It showed German mechanized divisions overwhelming static defenses. It explained how superior tactics and mobility defeated larger but less mobile forces. It analyzed military strategy in terms soldiers could understand and apply. The segment covering the Maginot Line became particularly instructive. France had spent billions on fortifications facing Germany. The concrete bunkers and defensive works represented the best military engineering of the era. But German forces simply drove around them through Belgium, making the fortifications irrelevant. The strategic lesson was clear. Preparing to fight the last war guaranteed defeat in the next one. Static defenses couldn't stop mobile warfare. The future belonged to speed, maneuver, and adaptability. American military doctrine absorbed this lesson, emphasizing mobility and air power over fixed positions. The Battle of Britain celebrated RAF resistance while explaining aerial warfare's new importance. The film showed how a small number of fighter pilots had prevented invasion. It documented the Blitz and civilian resilience under sustained bombing. It established air superiority as crucial to modern warfare. The film gave unprecedented attention to British civilians under bombardment. Footage showed Londoners sleeping in underground stations during air raids, fire brigades fighting blazes from incendiary bombs, children being evacuated from cities to countryside, buildings reduced to rubble while life continued around the destruction. This emphasis on civilian suffering served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that modern war targeted entire populations, not just military forces. It showed British resolve and resilience, strengthening the Anglo-American alliance. It prepared American audiences for the possibility that they too might face attack. It explained why defeating the Axis mattered for everyone's security. The aerial combat sequences were particularly effective. Gun camera footage from RAF fighters showed real dogfights over the Channel. German bombers falling in flames demonstrated British defensive success. Tracer rounds and flak explosions created visceral sense of danger. The film explained why Britain's survival mattered to America. As long as Britain held, the Atlantic remained a barrier to German power. If Britain fell, the Atlantic became a bridge for invasion. American security depended on British resistance. The message was clear. Britain's fight was America's fight. The most controversial film was The Battle of Russia. Released in 1943, it presented the Soviet Union as a heroic ally defending freedom. This required delicate navigation of political complexities. The Nazi-Soviet pact was mentioned only obliquely. Stalin's purges and authoritarianism went unmentioned. The focus remained on shared enemies and common cause against fascism. The film used spectacular combat footage from Soviet sources. Tank battles at Kursk and Stalingrad showed the Eastern Front's massive scale. Civilian suffering under German occupation demonstrated Nazi brutality. The Red Army's determination and sacrifice earned respectful portrayal. The opening sequences established Russia as a nation with deep cultural heritage. Tchaikovsky's music accompanied shots of churches, museums, and historic cities. The narration emphasized Russia's contributions to civilization, literature, music, science, art. This cultural context made Soviet defense seem like preservation of human achievement rather than just political survival. Footage of Nazi destruction shocked American audiences. Cities reduced to rubble by German artillery. Civilians executed in mass shootings. Prisoners of war starving in camps. Scorched earth tactics, destroying everything Germans couldn't hold. The film included a powerful sequence about the siege of Leningrad, 900 days under blockade, starvation reducing the population by hundreds of thousands, civilians eating leather and wallpaper paste to survive, artillery shells falling randomly into residential areas, yet the city never surrendered. This presentation of Soviet suffering created sympathy that transcended ideology. Americans watching understood that anyone enduring such hardship and continuing to fight deserved respect and support. The film's effectiveness in building support for Lend-Lease aid to the USSR was substantial. Roosevelt personally approved the film's civilian release. It helped shift American perception of the Soviets from suspicious to sympathetic. Public understanding of the Eastern Front's importance increased significantly. The film contributed to political support for Lend-Lease aid to the USSR. The statistical information was staggering. The film reported that 3/4 of all German divisions were fighting on the Eastern Front. Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. German casualties were equally catastrophic. The scale of combat in Russia dwarfed all other theaters combined. For American audiences, this context was revelatory. Many had assumed the European war meant primarily Britain fighting Germany. The film demonstrated that the Soviet Union was bearing the greatest burden. Understanding this reality helped justify American alliance with Stalin despite ideological differences. The Battle of China explained Japanese aggression and China's crucial resistance. It documented the rape of Nanking and other atrocities. It showed how China's massive population and determined resistance tied down millions of Japanese troops. It established China as a vital ally whose survival mattered to Allied victory. War Comes to America, the final film, traced America's journey into the conflict. It began by celebrating American values: liberty, equality, opportunity. It showed the nation's initial reluctance to enter foreign wars. It documented the rise of Nazi sympathizers within America, including a disturbing rally at Madison Square Garden where swastikas hung alongside portraits of George Washington. It explained how German and Japanese aggression made American involvement inevitable. It ended with American industrial might mobilizing for war. The series' production values were revolutionary for documentaries. Capra employed techniques from commercial cinema rarely seen in government films. Dynamic editing created narrative tension, music enhanced emotional impact, narration explained complex concepts clearly without condescension. Visual storytelling conveyed meaning beyond words. The films were initially created for military audiences. Every soldier underwent training that included viewing selected Why We Fight episodes. Studies attempted to measure the film's effectiveness on troop morale and understanding. Results were inconclusive in terms of statistical significance, but anecdotal evidence suggested profound impact. Veterans later recalled how the films shaped their understanding of the conflict. Many reported feeling the series gave them clarity about their mission. Some described experiencing emotional transformation, shifting from resentment about being drafted to conviction about necessity. The films didn't create warriors, but they created informed combatants who understood the stakes. By war's end, at least 54 million Americans had seen parts of the series. The films had been distributed to factories, schools, civic organizations, and churches. They played in commercial theaters before feature films. They were dubbed into multiple languages for Allied forces and liberated populations. The series influenced civilian morale significantly. Understanding why the war mattered helped sustain support through years of sacrifice. Rationing, blackouts, long working hours, and separation from loved ones became bearable when framed as necessary contributions to a just cause. The films helped transform the war effort from abstract concept to personal mission. Women working in defense factories reported that the films helped them feel connected to the fighting. Seeing how their labor, building bombers, manufacturing ammunition, welding ship hulls, directly enabled victory made tedious work meaningful. Factory managers screened Why We Fight films during lunch breaks and reported increased productivity and reduced absenteeism afterward. The films also served darker purposes. Racial stereotyping, particularly of Japanese, reflected and reinforced wartime prejudice. The portrayal of fascism, while accurate in its brutality, sometimes veered into caricature. Complex geopolitical realities were simplified into binary good versus evil narratives. The films were propaganda, after all, designed to persuade rather than to provide nuanced analysis. Critics, both contemporary and modern, have noted the series' limitations. The films presented World War II as a clear moral struggle, which it was, but they omitted uncomfortable complexities. Soviet atrocities went unmentioned. Racial segregation in American military was ignored. Strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians received heroic treatment. The films told truth, but not the whole truth. Yet within their propaganda framework, the Why We Fight series achieved something remarkable. They demonstrated that democracy could produce effective psychological warfare without abandoning democratic values. Unlike Nazi films that glorified dictatorship, the Why We Fight series explained war as defense of liberty. Unlike Axis propaganda that celebrated conquest, Allied films framed the conflict as necessary self-defense. The philosophical difference mattered. Nazi propaganda worked by creating fervent belief in nationalist mythology. Allied propaganda worked by explaining reality and trusting audiences to reach the correct conclusion. The former required suppressing dissent and controlling information. The latter allowed for debate while building consensus around factual understanding. Capra later reflected on the fundamental difference between Triumph of the Will and Why We Fight. Riefenstahl's film was aesthetically brilliant, but morally bankrupt. It celebrated evil with extraordinary artistry. His films were less visually spectacular but morally grounded. They documented reality, to serve truth. The contrast revealed different visions of cinema's purpose and power. The series' long-term impact extended far beyond World War II. Techniques Capra pioneered became standard in documentary filmmaking, using archival footage recontextualized with narration, combining maps and animation to explain strategic concepts, emotional storytelling grounded in factual accuracy, music and editing to create narrative momentum. Television documentary series like Victory at Sea and The World at War followed Capra's template. Modern documentary filmmakers still study why we fight for its craft and effectiveness. The series established that government films could achieve Hollywood production values. It proved that educational content could be emotionally compelling. The military continued producing propaganda films throughout the Cold War, using lessons from Why We Fight. The series became required viewing at intelligence agencies studying psychological operations. Film schools taught it as a case study in propaganda techniques and documentary ethics. Historians referenced it as both historical artifact and historical evidence. Beyond filmmaking technique, Why We Fight demonstrated cinema's power to shape mass belief. The films helped transform American public opinion from isolationist to interventionist. They maintained morale through years of grinding conflict. They created shared understanding of the war's meaning across a diverse population. In this sense, cinema genuinely did help decide the fate of nations, not through military force, but through psychological influence. Not by changing battlefield outcomes directly, but by sustaining the will to fight, not by destroying enemy forces, but by strengthening resolve to continue fighting until victory. The effectiveness of film as propaganda alarmed some observers. Lowell Mellett, coordinator of government films, worried about the hysteria Why We Fight might create. He feared that films so effective at generating support for war could be equally effective in generating support for peacetime authoritarianism. The same techniques that motivated sacrifice for just causes could potentially be used to motivate sacrifice for unjust ones. This anxiety reflected broader concerns about mass media's power. Radio, film, and eventually television could reach millions simultaneously with coordinated messages. Whoever controlled these channels could potentially manipulate public opinion on unprecedented scales. Democratic societies struggled with how to use such powerful tools without betraying democratic values. The Office of War Information attempted to address this tension. It established guidelines requiring that propaganda be truthful. False information, even if effective, was prohibited. Films could emphasize certain facts over others, but they couldn't fabricate facts. This constraint distinguished Allied propaganda from Axis propaganda, which embraced lies as policy. The distinction sometimes blurred in practice. War Comes to America, for example, used some reenacted scenes without clearly labeling them as such. By modern journalistic standards, this would be unethical. But Capra and his team believed they were capturing truth through dramatization. The events depicted had occurred. Recreating them for cameras simply documented what couldn't otherwise be filmed. The ethical complexities of propaganda filmmaking continue debating. Is it acceptable to manipulate emotions for just causes? How much simplification of complex reality is permissible in service of necessary mobilization? When does persuasion become manipulation? Where is the line between inspiration and indoctrination? The Why We Fight series doesn't provide easy answers to these questions. It exists in moral grey space, truthful enough to avoid being lies, but selective enough to be propaganda. It informed audiences while simultaneously persuading them. It documented reality while constructing narrative. Frank Capra received the Distinguished Service Medal for his work on the series. The citation praised his contribution to the war effort as comparable to battlefield heroism. His films had helped win a war, not through violence, but through clarifying purpose. After the war, Capra returned to Hollywood and made It's a Wonderful Life. That film, like Why We Fight, used cinema to explore what makes life worth defending. It celebrated ordinary people, individual liberty, and community bonds, the same values the war had been fought to protect. The connection between Capra's wartime propaganda and his peacetime humanism reveals something crucial. Why We Fight worked because it was rooted in genuine belief. Capra wasn't cynically manipulating audiences. He was expressing convictions he held deeply. The films persuaded because their creator was himself persuaded. This authenticity made the propaganda effective. Audiences sensed they were being told truth, even if selectively presented. The alternative was Nazi propaganda, which felt hollow despite its visual power. Riefenstahl's technical brilliance couldn't hide the moral emptiness at fascism's core. The contrast between Triumph of the Will and Why We Fight ultimately reflected the war's fundamental character. Fascism was aesthetically seductive, but philosophically barren. Democracy was less visually spectacular, but grounded in human dignity. The former promised glory through submission. The latter defended freedom through sacrifice. Cinema became the medium where this philosophical battle played out. Both sides understood that modern war required psychological commitment. Armies needed soldiers willing to die. Populations needed endurance through years of hardship. Workers needed motivation to labor beyond normal limits. Film could create that commitment more effectively than speeches, posters, or radio broadcasts. Moving images with sound created immersive experiences that shaped emotion and belief. Audiences identified with people on screen in ways reading couldn't replicate. Music and narration guided interpretation in ways static images couldn't. The power was double-edged. Used for evil, cinema could glorify tyranny and incite atrocity. Triumph of the Will had helped mobilize Germans for conquest and genocide. Japanese propaganda films had prepared populations to support aggressive war. But, used for good, cinema could inspire defense of liberty and resistance to oppression. Why We Fight had helped sustain the alliance that defeated fascism. The stakes of controlling cinema during World War II were therefore immense. Hollywood's role in the Allied victory, while less celebrated than battlefield heroics, was strategically crucial. The film industry didn't just entertain troops on leave, it shaped understanding of why the war mattered and what victory would mean. The Roosevelt administration recognized this from the war's beginning. The Office of War Information coordinated closely with Hollywood studios. Scripts were reviewed for propaganda value. Themes were suggested that would support war aims. Studios cooperated, sometimes reluctantly, understanding their patriotic obligation. The result was thousands of films supporting the war effort. Some were explicitly propaganda like Why We Fight. Others were entertainment that subtly reinforced war aims. Combat films showed American valor and enemy brutality. Romantic comedies maintained morale through laughter. Musicals provided escapism while celebrating American culture. The Office of War Information developed a manual for the motion picture industry. It outlined themes that should be emphasized in commercial films. The enemy, show them as dangerous, cruel, and fanatical. The Allies, present them as brave, democratic, and unified. The home front, emphasize sacrifice, unity, and productivity. The issues, explain what we're fighting for, not just against. studios received these guidelines and incorporated them into productions. Not through heavy-handed propaganda, but through subtle integration into entertainment narratives. A romantic comedy might include a scene of characters buying war bonds. A musical might feature a production number honoring defense workers. A Western might have the hero express determination to fight fascism after the current conflict. The subtlety made the propaganda more effective. Audiences didn't feel lectured. They felt entertained while absorbing messages. Elmer Davis, head of the OWE, explained the strategy precisely. The easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into most people's minds is to let it go in through the medium of an entertainment picture when they do not realize that they are being propagandized. Casablanca exemplified this approach perfectly. On the surface, it was a romance about lost love rediscovered. Rick and Ilsa's relationship provided the emotional core, but the film was saturated with pro-war messaging. Rick's transformation from cynical isolationist to committed anti-fascist mirrored America's journey. His famous line, "I stick my neck out for nobody," gave way to self-sacrifice for the greater good. The film's climax involved choosing duty over personal happiness, a message resonating with wartime audiences making similar choices. The film depicted Nazis as thugs, French resistance fighters as heroes, and American expatriates as ultimately doing the right thing. The message was clear without being preachy. Freedom mattered more than comfort. Personal sacrifice was noble. Neutrality in the face of evil was moral failure. Casablanca won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1943. It grossed substantially more than projections suggested. Audiences embraced it not despite its propaganda, but because the propaganda aligned with their values and experiences. Mrs. Miniver delivered similar messages through domestic drama. The film showed a British family enduring the Blitz. It portrayed civilians as frontline warriors facing danger with grace. The famous scene of the family huddled in their bomb shelter while German planes roared overhead brought the war home to American audiences. The film's climax occurred in a church damaged by bombing. The vicar delivered a sermon that became one of the war's most powerful propaganda moments. This is not only a war of soldiers in uniform, it is a war of the people, of all the people. And it must be fought not only on the battlefield, but in the cities and in the villages, in the factories and on the farms, in the home and in the heart of every man, woman, and child who loves freedom. The speech articulated total war's nature while framing it as defense of civilization. Winston Churchill reportedly said the film did more for the war effort than a fleet of battleships. President Roosevelt had excerpts from the vicar's speech airdropped over occupied Europe. The film won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. American audiences watched it and saw reflected their own anxieties and determination. British audiences saw their suffering acknowledged and honoured. The film strengthened the Anglo-American alliance through shared cultural experience. Combat films created specific images of American military valor. Bataan showed American defenders making last stands against impossible odds. Wake Island depicted Marines refusing surrender despite overwhelming Japanese forces. Air Force followed a bomber crew through the early Pacific campaign. These films established archetypes that shaped public understanding of military service. The stoic leader who never shows fear. The wise-cracking soldier who maintains morale through humor. The raw recruit who becomes hardened warrior. The diverse group uniting across regional and class differences. The diversity theme was particularly emphasized. Combat units in films included soldiers from different backgrounds. A Brooklyn Jew might fight alongside a Texas rancher and a Harvard graduate. This reflected America's melting pot ideal while reinforcing national unity. The message was clear. Americans might disagree about everything else, but they united against common enemies. The portrayal of African American soldiers presented complications. Racial segregation in the military was official policy. Black soldiers served in separate units under white officers. This reality conflicted with propaganda narratives about fighting for freedom. The Negro soldier, produced separately from Why We Fight, but using similar techniques, addressed this tension. The film celebrated black contributions to American military history. It showed black soldiers training and serving with dignity. It emphasized that all Americans shared responsibility for defeating fascism. The film walked a difficult line. It couldn't show racial integration that didn't exist. But it needed to motivate black Americans to support a war fought by a segregated military. The solution was to frame military service as a path toward earning full citizenship rights. The film was effective within its constraints. It increased black recruitment and morale. It subtly challenged segregation by showing black excellence and patriotism. But it couldn't transform the fundamental injustice of segregated armed forces. Women's portrayal in wartime films evolved to reflect changing economic realities. Early in the war, women appeared primarily as sweethearts and wives waiting for soldiers to return. As women entered defense industries in massive numbers, films began showing them as workers and contributors. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic image, but she appeared in films as well as posters. Movies showed women welding, driving rivets, operating heavy machinery. The message was that women's industrial labor was as crucial as men's combat. Simultaneously, films reassured audiences that women's new roles were temporary. They emphasized femininity even in industrial settings, women maintaining appearance and romance despite factory work. The implication was that after victory, women would return happily to domestic roles. This messaging reflected cultural anxieties about changing gender roles. The war required women's labor, but society wasn't ready to fundamentally restructure gender norms. Films tried to have it both ways, celebrating women's contributions while suggesting normalcy would return with peace. Musical films provided escapism while reinforcing patriotic themes. Yankee Doodle Dandy told George M. Cohan's story with flag-waving enthusiasm. This Is the Army featured Irving Berlin's songs celebrating American military. The films offered entertainment while strengthening national pride and morale. Even films with no obvious war content served propaganda purposes. Escapist fantasies allowed audiences temporary relief from wartime stress. Comedies provided laughter that maintained psychological resilience. The very act of attending movies demonstrated life continuing despite global conflict. Theatre owners actively participated in the propaganda effort. Lobbies featured war bond sales booths. Ushers encouraged bond purchases. Some theatres offered free admission to anyone buying bonds. Containers collected scrap metal and rubber. The movie theatre became a civic space reinforcing collective purpose. Newsreels before features showed war progress. Shorts promoted war effort themes. Trailers advertised upcoming war-related films. Even concession stands carried V for Victory branding. The cumulative impact of this total mobilization of cinema was profound. Americans couldn't attend movies without encountering war messaging. The repetition created normalized understanding of the conflict. Supporting the war became as natural as buying popcorn. By 1943, Hollywood had produced more than 500 war-related films. The volume ensured saturation coverage across all genres and audiences. Children, teenagers, adults, and elderly all encountered war narratives appropriate to their demographics, the psychological impact manifested in measurable behaviors. Over 16 million Americans served in uniform during the war. War bond drives raised $185 billion from a population of 130 million. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, millions working in defense industries. Agricultural production increased to feed both Americans and Allies despite labor shortages. These achievements required mass mobilization sustained over 4 years. Propaganda films like Why We Fight contributed to sustaining that mobilization. They didn't create American victory. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and workers did. But they helped create the shared understanding that made sacrifice acceptable. The specific mechanisms through which films influence behavior are complex. Direct causation is impossible to prove. Would Americans have supported the war without propaganda films? Almost certainly. Pearl Harbor created genuine outrage and determination. But propaganda helped channel that initial anger into sustained commitment. It transformed emotional response into rational understanding of strategic goals. It maintained morale through defeats and setbacks. It explained why continued sacrifice remained necessary even as victory approached. Psychological studies conducted during the war attempted to measure film impact. Soldiers were tested before and after viewing Why We Fight films. Researchers looked for changes in knowledge, attitudes, and stated willingness to fight. Results showed consistent increases in factual knowledge about the war. Soldiers who watched the films scored higher on tests about enemy capabilities and Allied strategy. They could better explain why America entered the war and what victory would require. Attitude changes were more subtle and harder to measure. Some soldiers reported increased conviction about the war's necessity. Others showed no measurable change in existing attitudes. The films seemed most effective with soldiers who began neutral or uncertain, rather than those already strongly committed or opposed. The research methodology had significant limitations. Measuring attitude change through questionnaires captured only conscious, reportable beliefs. Deeper psychological impacts, subconscious associations, emotional conditioning, identity formation, remained unmeasured. Moreover, the artificial testing environment differed from actual film viewing experiences. The broader lesson transcends World War II. Cinema, and by extension all mass media, possesses extraordinary power to shape collective belief and behavior. That power can serve liberty or tyranny depending on who controls it and to what ends. Democratic societies must grapple with how to use such power without betraying democratic values. The Why We Fight series represents one answer to that challenge. Use truth selectively, but don't lie. Persuade through emotion, but ground persuasion in reality. Simplify complex situations, but don't falsify them. Mobilize population for war while preserving the values that make freedom worth defending. Whether this balance was perfectly achieved remains debatable. The films occasionally veered into oversimplification. They sometimes portrayed allies too heroically and enemies too monolithically. They omitted uncomfortable truths about Allied conduct and strategy. But compared to Axis propaganda, Why We Fight represented a different species of messaging. Nazi films celebrated conquest. American films explained necessary defense. Japanese propaganda glorified domination. Allied films defended liberation. Fascist cinema demanded submission. Democratic cinema trusted informed citizens to choose correctly. This philosophical difference ultimately reflected the war's meaning. The conflict wasn't merely between nations or ideologies. It was between fundamentally different visions of human nature and society. Fascism assumed humans needed masters to guide them toward greatness. Democracy assumed humans could govern themselves through reason and cooperation. Cinema became the arena where these competing visions fought for adherence. Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will argued visually for the beauty of submission to superior will. Capra's Why We Fight argued verbally for the necessity of defending human freedom. The former was more aesthetically innovative. The latter was more morally defensible. History vindicated Capra's approach. The Allies won the war, and with it, the psychological battle over which vision would shape the post-war world. Cinema had helped achieve that victory by sustaining belief in democracy even when fascism seemed unstoppable. After the war ended, the Why We Fight series took on new meanings. Schools used them to teach World War II history. Universities analyzed them as propaganda case studies. Military academies trained officers in psychological operations using them. The series' techniques influenced Cold War propaganda extensively. The United States Information Agency created documentaries following the Why We Fight template. The fundamental approach, using truth selectively but not lying, became American propaganda doctrine. Soviet propagandists studied the films but struggled to replicate their effectiveness. Totalitarian systems couldn't trust audiences with truth, even selectively presented. This gave democratic propaganda a crucial advantage. The series influenced documentary filmmaking far beyond propaganda. Television series like Victory at Sea and Ken Burns's later work used Capra's techniques. Archival footage recontextualized with narration, music and editing to create emotional impact. The educational documentary, as popular entertainment, became viable. Film schools incorporated Why We Fight into curricula as essential viewing. The films became artifacts of their era, revealing 1940s American psychology. The racial stereotypes, particularly of Japanese, showed wartime prejudice starkly. The simplified narrative revealed how Americans understood the conflict's complexity. The emotional manipulation demonstrated what techniques 1940s audiences found persuasive. Modern viewers watching the films experience cognitive dissonance. The propaganda techniques are transparent to contemporary audiences in ways they weren't to 1940s viewers. The racial stereotyping and simplistic narratives are jarring. The moral certainty seems quaint in an era of more ambiguous conflicts, yet the films still communicate something essential about World War II. They capture the conviction that shaped the greatest generation. They document how a diverse, contentious democracy unified against existential threat. They show how cinema helped transform individual Americans into a collective force that saved the world from tyranny. The series also revealed propaganda's inherent limitations and dangers. The same techniques that mobilized Americans for just war could mobilize them for unjust ones. The same emotional manipulation that sustained morale could sustain destructive nationalism. The same simplification that made complex conflicts comprehensible could make nuanced reality invisible. These concerns shaped post-war debates about mass media's role in democracy. Could propaganda techniques be used ethically in peacetime? Should government produce films shaping public opinion on controversial issues? Where was the line between legitimate persuasion and dangerous manipulation? The answers remained contested, but Why We Fight established that democracies could produce effective propaganda when necessary. The question became when it was necessary and who decided. The series' legacy included unintended consequences. Film techniques developed for propaganda became standard in commercial advertising. Madison Avenue hired veterans of wartime propaganda film production. They recognized that techniques creating political commitment could create brand loyalty. This commercialization troubled some observers. Were Americans being constantly manipulated by psychological methods developed for warfare? Television's rise intensified these concerns. Political advertising rapidly incorporated propaganda film techniques. The 1952 Eisenhower campaign employed people who had produced wartime propaganda. Critics warned that propaganda techniques used continuously in peacetime could undermine democracy. Defenders argued that democratic citizens could learn to recognize and resist manipulation. Media literacy could teach people to analyze propaganda critically. The debate continues today. Why We Fight represented an early milestone in mass media's ability to shape collective belief. Social media represents the latest evolution. The fundamental questions remain the same. How much influence should mass media have over public opinion? Can persuasion techniques be used ethically? What responsibilities do content creators have when wielding such influential tools? The Why We Fight series doesn't answer these questions, but it makes them unavoidable. It demonstrated that cinema could shape reality by shaping how people understood reality. Modern audiences watching the films experience both their power and their limitations. The propaganda techniques are now transparent, but the films still demonstrate how skillfully deployed media can shape mass psychology. For students of World War II, the films provide primary source evidence of what American authorities wanted citizens to believe. For students of filmmaking, they illustrate documentary craft at high levels. For students of propaganda, they demonstrate ethical complexity, manipulative yet truthful, simplified yet educational. The series' ultimate vindication came from the outcome it helped achieve. The Allies won World War II. Democracy defeated fascism. Cinema didn't win that victory alone. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and resistance fighters won it through courage and sacrifice. But cinema contributed in ways that mattered. It sustained morale when victory seemed distant. It maintained unity when divisions threatened cohesion. It transformed abstract geopolitical conflict into personal moral imperative. Frank Capra's answer to his initial despair watching Triumph of the Will succeeded beyond expectations. He trusted that truth, skillfully presented, could compete with beautiful falsehood. He believed that free people, informed about stakes, would choose to defend freedom. The Why We Fight series proved him right. Not perfectly. The films had flaws, limitations, blind spots. But fundamentally, they demonstrated that democratic propaganda could be effective without betraying democratic values. That legacy matters today. In an era of misinformation and algorithmic manipulation, the question of how to use media ethically remains urgent. Every generation grapples with how to use communication tools responsibly. Every democracy must balance free expression against protection from manipulation. The Why We Fight series shows one historical moment when those questions were answered well enough to help save civilization from destruction, well enough to mobilize a nation and sustain a war effort. Cinema became weapon, truth became ammunition, understanding became victory. And 54 million Americans learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on beaches or in cities, but in hearts and minds. One frame at a time. They never expected cinema to decide the fate of nations, but it did. Not through deception, but through clarity. Not by manipulating the masses, but by informing citizens. Not by glorifying war, but by explaining why this war, however terrible, was necessary and just. That legacy endures wherever truth confronts lies, wherever freedom faces tyranny, wherever democracy defends itself against authoritarianism. How do we use powerful communication tools to serve truth rather than falsehood? How do we persuade without manipulating, inform without indoctrinating? The Why We Fight series doesn't answer these questions definitively, but it shows they can be answered well enough to matter, well enough to mobilize a nation, well enough to help save the world, and sometimes, in human affairs, well enough is everything. In the end, Frank Capra's answer to his initial question, how do we counter Nazi propaganda, succeeded brilliantly, not by matching Riefenstahl's aesthetic grandeur, not by creating equally spectacular lies, but by trusting that truth, skillfully presented, could compete with beautiful falsehood, by believing that free people, informed about the stakes, would choose to defend freedom, by having faith that democracy's awkward reality would ultimately defeat fascism's elegant fiction. The Why We Fight series proved him right. Cinema did help decide the fate of nations, not through deception, but through clarity, not by manipulating the masses, but by informing citizens, not by glorifying war, but by explaining why this war, however terrible, was necessary and just. That legacy endures. Whenever documentary filmmakers use archival footage to tell truth, whenever governments struggle with how to communicate with citizens honestly in crisis, whenever anyone asks whether cinema can serve higher purposes than mere entertainment, the answer points back to those 7 films Frank Capra made in response to Leni Riefenstahl. Cinema became weapon, truth became ammunition, understanding became victory, and 54 million Americans learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on beaches or in cities, but in hearts and minds, one frame at a time,